We went on national TV for a paternity test, expecting drama. What we got was a DNA revelation so shocking it connected two feuding families in a way no one could have ever imagined. The air backstage at the Steve Harvey show tastes like hairspray and desperation. I squeezed my sister Chloe's hand, her palms slick with sweat. On the monitor, we could see the live audience, a sea of clapping, cheering strangers, completely oblivious to the fact that our lives were about to be dissected and judged for their entertainment. "You're doing the right thing," I whispered, more to convince myself than her. Chloe just nodded, her eyes fixed on the fuzzy image of her 1-year-old daughter, Lily, who was being held by our mom in the designated family area. Lily, the tiny, innocent reason we were all here. Across the narrow hallway, in the other dressing room, we could hear them. Mark and his mother, Brenda. Their laughter was loud, abrasive, and full of a confidence that made my stomach turn. Mark was Chloe's ex, the man who had sworn he loved her, who had promised her the world, and then vanished the second she told him she was pregnant. He claimed there was no way the baby was his. His mother, a woman who looked like she gargled with venom every morning, had been leading the charge, slandering Chloe all over our small town. Gold digger, liar, trash. We'd heard it all. Going on national television was our last resort. We needed the child support, but more than that, Chloe needed the world to know she wasn't a liar. A producer with a headset and a clipboard-sized smile popped her head in. "5 minutes, ladies. You ready to find out the truth?" Her cheerfulness felt like a slap in the face. Before we could answer, Brenda came storming out of her dressing room, pointing a perfectly manicured, blood-red nail at my sister. "You can still back out, you know," she sneered, her voice a low growl. "Save yourself the humiliation when the whole world finds out what you are." I stepped in front of Chloe, my body tensing. I'm 2 years older and about a foot taller than Brenda's puffed-up ego. "The only person who should be worried about humiliation is your son, Brenda," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Maybe you should have taught him about responsibility instead of how to run from it." Her eyes narrowed. "My Mark is a good boy. He wouldn't be caught dead with the likes of her if she hadn't trapped him. I know that baby isn't his. Look at her, not a drop of Peterson blood in her." The producer clapped her hands nervously. Okay, let's save the fireworks for the stage, folks. That's what the people want to see." She winked, and I felt a wave of nausea. We were just characters in their daily drama. Walking out onto that stage was surreal. The lights were blindingly hot, the applause deafening. Steve Harvey, looking immaculate in a tailored suit, greeted us with a warm, sympathetic smile that almost made me believe he actually cared. He was a master at this, guiding the conversation, letting Chloe tell her story with tears welling in her eyes, then turning to Mark, who sat there looking smug and unbothered. "I mean, look, Steve," Mark said, shrugging at the audience. "I was young, we had some fun, but she was seeing other people. I'm not trying to be a bad guy, I just want the truth." Lies. Every word was a calculated lie, and I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me. From her seat in the front row, Brenda nodded emphatically, mouthing, "That's right," to anyone who would look at her. My own father, a quiet, stoic man, sat a few seats down, his face a mask of stone. He hated this, all of it, but he was here for Chloe, just like Mark's father was there for him, sitting beside Brenda, looking deeply uncomfortable. Then came the moment. Steve held up the single, terrifyingly official-looking manila envelope. The cheesy, dramatic music swelled and then died down, leaving a thick, heavy silence in the studio. "The results of the DNA test are in this envelope," Steve announced, his voice suddenly serious. "Now, before I open this, I want to say something. There is a child's life at the center of all this, a little girl named Lily, and no matter what this paper says, she deserves to be loved and cared for." He looked directly at Mark, whose smug expression finally faltered for a fraction of a second. My heart was a drum against my ribs. I held Chloe's hand so tightly our knuckles were white. This was it. The validation or the complete and utter devastation. Steve tore open the envelope. He pulled out the single sheet of paper and his eyes scanned the page. We all watched his face, trying to read it. His professional smile faltered. He blinked, then read it again. A small frown creased his forehead. He looked up, not at Chloe or Mark, but out at the audience, his eyes sweeping over our families. The silence stretched on, becoming unbearable. He lowered the paper slightly, a strange, confused look on his face. "Well," he said slowly, this is a first." The audience murmured. Mark shifted in his seat. "What does it say, Steve?" "Just tell her I'm not the dad, so I can get on with my life," Mark shouted, a little too eager. Steve held up a hand, silencing him without even looking at him. His gaze was locked somewhere between our father and Mark's father. "Everybody be quiet," he said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding tone that instantly silenced the entire studio. The air crackled with tension. He lifted the paper again. "Okay, Mark," he began, finally looking at the sniveling man beside my sister. "In the case of 1-year-old Lily, the DNA test results show that you are not the father." A massive, triumphant scream erupted from Brenda. Mark leaped to his feet, pumping his fist in the air. "I told you! I told you!" he yelled, pointing at a stunned and crumpling Chloe. The audience gasped. My world tilted on its axis as Chloe began to sob next to me. But Steve wasn't finished. He held up his hand again, his face now grim, almost angry. "I'm not done," he boomed, his voice cutting through the celebration. "Everybody sit down and shut up, now." The noise died instantly. Mark and Brenda froze. Steve's eyes, hard as steel, found Mark's father, Mr. Peterson, and then shifted to my own dad. "The lab ran the test twice because they thought they'd made a mistake," Steve said, his voice low and heavy with meaning. "The results show a 99.9% probability of paternity. Lily's father is in this room, but the DNA markers, they're a direct paternal match to both of your families." He stared at the two patriarchs sitting in the front row. "Mr. Peterson," he said, locking eyes with Mark's dad. "And Mr. Evans," he said, turning to my own horrified father. "I have no idea what this means, but the lab says the father of this child is either your son or your brother." The words hung in the air, thick and impossible. "Your brother." A sound escaped from Brenda's throat, a strangled mix of a laugh and a gasp. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath, a collective intake of air that sucked all the oxygen out of the room. My head whipped around to look at my dad, then at Mark's father, Mr. Peterson. They were sitting about 20 feet apart, two strangers brought together by their children's mess. But were they strangers? My father, David Evans, looked like he'd been turned to stone. His face, usually weathered and kind, was pale, his lips a thin white line. He was staring at Mr. Peterson with an expression of pure, unadulterated confusion. Mr. Peterson, on the other hand, had gone from uncomfortable to ghostly. The color had drained from his face, and he was looking at my dad as if he'd seen a specter from a long-forgotten nightmare. What did he say?" Chloe whimpered beside me, pulling me out of my trance. I wrapped my arm around her, trying to shield her from the 1,000 pairs of eyes that were now dissecting our family. "I don't know, honey." "It's a mistake. It has to be a mistake," I whispered, but the words felt hollow. On stage, Steve Harvey was looking back and forth between the two men, his showman's instincts clearly at war with his genuine shock. "Mr. Evans? Mr. Peterson," he said, his voice low and steady. "I need you to look at me. The lab says you two share the same paternal DNA, that you're brothers." Brenda finally found her voice. She shot to her feet, her face contorted with rage. "This is an outrage!" "A trick. My husband is an only child. His parents are dead. This is just another one of their schemes to get at our money," she screeched, pointing a trembling finger at my father. "This man is a stranger. We've never seen him before in our lives." My dad finally moved. He stood up slowly, his movements stiff. "She's right," he said, his voice raspy but firm, cutting through Brenda's tirade. "I don't know this man. I have a sister, but I don't have a brother." He looked at Steve Harvey, his eyes pleading for reason. "Your test is wrong. It's that simple." The audience was in an uproar, shouting, whispering, the raw drama unfolding exactly as the producers had hoped. A camera swooped in low, capturing the sweat beading on my father's forehead. Another camera was zoomed in on Mr. Peterson's face, which was now a mask of pure agony. He wouldn't look at anyone. He just stared at the floor, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so hard his knuckles were white. "Honey, tell them!" Brenda shrieked at her husband. "Tell them you're an only child! Tell them these people are liars!" But Mr. Peterson didn't say anything. His silence was more damning than any confession. Steve took a step forward. "Mr. Peterson? Sir, I need you to answer me. Is this man, David Evans, your brother?" Everyone leaned in. The world shrunk to the space between Steve Harvey's question and the silent, trembling man in the front row. Mr. Peterson slowly, agonizingly, lifted his head. His eyes were glassy with unshed tears. He didn't look at Steve. He didn't look at his furious wife. He looked past them all, his gaze landing directly on my father. My dad recoiled slightly, as if struck. The two men stared at each other across the studio, across what felt like an ocean of time and secrets. Brenda's voice had died in her throat. Mark looked like a lost child. The entire audience was dead silent, waiting. Finally, a choked sound came from Mr. Peterson's throat. His lips trembled as he spoke, his voice a broken whisper that was somehow audible in the crushing silence. "They told me you died in the fire," he rasped, his eyes locked on my father's horrified face. "David? They told me you were gone." My father swayed on his feet, his hand flying to his chest as if to keep his heart from exploding. "Michael," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips, a name I had never ever heard him speak before. "My God, Michael?" The two men, our fathers, stared at each other, their shared history a palpable, crushing force in the room. But the shockwave wasn't over. Steve Harvey, holding the paper, looked down at it one more time, his own face a picture of dawning horror as another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked up at my sobbing sister Chloe, then at the stunned, silent Mark. "The lab also tested both mothers," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "to ensure there were no mix-ups." He looked directly at Brenda, and then at my mom, who was just being escorted into the studio by a producer holding Lily in her arms. "According to these results, Steve said, his voice cracking. Lily's grandmothers are identical twins. A collective, high-pitched shriek ripped through the studio, and it took me a second to realize it was coming from Brenda. It wasn't a sound of anger anymore. It was the sound of a mind snapping. "No!" she screamed, her perfectly coiffed hair coming undone as she shook her head violently. "Lies! I was adopted. I have no sister. I am an only child." Her eyes, wide and frantic, darted around the studio before landing on my mother, who stood frozen by the stage entrance, clutching Lily to her chest. My mother, Sarah Evans, looked like she was staring at her own reflection in a funhouse mirror. Her face, which I knew as well as my own, was mirrored on the screaming woman in the front row. They had the same high cheekbones, the same sharp jawline, the same startlingly blue eyes. But where my mother's face was etched with the lines of a hard-working, gentle life, Brenda's was a taut mask of expensive creams and perpetual fury. My mom took a faltering step forward, her lips parting, but no sound came out. The baby in her arms, my niece Lily, started to cry, sensing the fractured, terrifying energy in the room. The chaos was absolute. The audience was on its feet, a roaring wave of noise and flashing cell phone cameras. Producers were swarming the stage, trying to restore order, their headsets crackling with panicked voices. In the middle of it all, the two men at the heart of the storm seemed to be in their own silent world. My father took a shaky step towards the front row, his hand outstretched. "Michael?" he said again, his voice thick with a grief I'd never heard before. "The orphanage, after the fire. They said everyone was gone." Mr. Peterson, no, Michael, finally tore his gaze away from my dad and looked at his wife. He saw the sheer panic in Brenda's eyes and then looked at my mother, standing there like a ghost from a past he never knew he had. The realization seemed to hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back into his seat, his head in his hands. "It can't be," he moaned. "Her name was Catherine. Your name is Sarah." My mother flinched as if he'd slapped her. "They changed it when I was adopted," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din. "My name was Catherine." Brenda let out another wail, collapsing into her seat and sobbing hysterically. Steve Harvey, to his credit, was trying to wrestle the show back from the brink of total anarchy. "People! People! Quiet down!" he yelled into his microphone, his voice amplified to a thunderous boom that finally cut through the noise. "Security! Get the aisles clear! Everybody sit down! Now!" Slowly, reluctantly, the audience settled. The producers backed away. The cameras refocused. A tense, fragile silence fell once more. "Now listen to me," Steve said, his face slick with sweat, his professional demeanor hanging on by a thread. "We need to understand what this means." He pointed the crumpled DNA report at the geneticist who had been brought on stage earlier for expert commentary and was now staring at our families like a science experiment gone horribly, wonderfully wrong. "Doctor, explain this. Brothers and identical twins. What does that mean for their children?" The doctor, a woman named Dr. Mills, cleared her throat, adjusting her glasses. "Genetically speaking," she began, her voice steady despite the chaos, "it means that Chloe and Mark aren't just first cousins. They share the same amount of DNA as half-siblings. Mark, who had been standing dumbly beside Chloe this whole time, finally seemed to process something. Wait, so we're related?" he stammered, looking at Chloe with a new kind of horror. "Like, related? Chloe just stared at him, her face a blank canvas of shock, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "This explains the initial confusion at the lab," Steve interjected, taking back control. "They tested Mark against Lily and it came back negative, but the paternity index was still unusually high, suggesting a close relative was the father. That's why they ran the extended family panel." He took a deep breath, steeling himself. He was looking at my father and his newfound brother again, the two men who had lost each other in a fire and found each other on national television. "The lab assumed the father had to be Mark's paternal uncle," Steve said, gesturing towards my dad. "But when they tested your sample, Mr. Evans, that also came back negative." A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through my family. My dad wasn't involved. Of course he wasn't. The thought was monstrous. "So then who is it?" I demanded, my voice raw. "If it's not Mark, and it's not my father, who is Lily's dad?" Steve's eyes were filled with a strange, heavy pity. He looked down at the paper in his hand one last time. "That's the thing," he said slowly. "With this new information, that the fathers are brothers and the mothers are sisters, the lab had to rerun everything. The genetic markers were so intertwined, so unprecedented, that they couldn't isolate the father with a standard test." He looked at the two shattered families, at the crying baby, at the wreckage of all our lives broadcast in high definition. "This document doesn't prove who Lily's father is," Steve said, his voice dropping to a somber, funereal tone. "It proves who he can't be." He looked directly at Chloe, his eyes full of a sorrow that felt terrifyingly real. "Chloe," he said gently, "according to this, because of the unique genetic circumstances, Lily's DNA is incompatible with Mark, his father Michael, and my father David. None of them can be the father." My mind reeled. If none of the men in either family could be the father, then who was? Was there someone else? Had Chloe lied? No, impossible. Steve held up his hand before anyone could speak. "But there's one more thing," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The lab found something else in Lily's DNA, a rare genetic anomaly, a mitochondrial DNA sequence that could only be passed down from the mother's direct maternal line." He looked from my weeping mother to her hysterical, newly discovered twin sister, Brenda. "This specific genetic marker is so rare, it's only been recorded in one other family in the national database, a family that was part of a fertility study in Ohio 30 years ago." My mother's head shot up, her eyes wide with a terror I had never seen before. "A study," Steve continued, his voice heavy with dread, "run by a doctor who was later arrested and sent to prison for secretly using his own genetic material to inseminate dozens of his patients." The studio lights felt like interrogations lamps. The doctor's name, once uttered by Steve Harvey, seemed to suck all the remaining air out of the room. I didn't recognize it, but my mother did. Her hand flew to her mouth, a stifled sob escaping. Across the stage, Brenda stopped crying. Her head snapped up, her mascara-streaked face a mask of dawning, abject horror. She was looking at my mother, but seeing something else, a memory 30 years buried. It turned out that Catherine and Sarah weren't just sisters, they were twins, separated at birth by a closed adoption agency that had since burned to the ground along with all its records. Raised in different states, with no knowledge of each other, they had both ended up, by some cruel twist of fate, at the same fertility clinic in Columbus, Ohio, within a year of each other. Both had struggled to conceive their first child. Both had been treated by the same esteemed, charming, and utterly monstrous doctor. The implications hit me like a physical blow. I looked at my sister, my beautiful, broken sister, Chloe. Then I looked at Mark. His smugness finally and completely evaporated, replaced by a slack-jawed, vacant stare. If what Steve was saying was true, then we weren't just related through our parents. Chloe and Mark, my sister and the man who had denied her child, shared another, more chilling connection. They were half-siblings, not through their feuding families, but through a predator in a lab coat. And Lily, my tiny, innocent niece, was the product of that unwitting genetic nightmare. She was the doctor's granddaughter. The show dissolved into a commercial break, but for us, the world had simply stopped. Security guards formed a human wall around us, shielding us from the gawking audience as producers rushed us backstage into a private green room. It was chaos. Brenda was in a full-blown panic attack, hyperventilating while her husband, Michael, my uncle, tried to comfort her, his own face a gray canvas of shock. My dad had his arm around my mom, who was just staring into space, replaying 3 decades of her life in her head. Chloe had completely shut down. She sat on a plush sofa, rocking back and forth, holding Lily so tightly the baby started to fuss. I knelt in front of her. "Chloe, look at me," I pleaded. "We're going to figure this out." She just shook her head, tears rolling down her face. "He's my brother," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Mark is my brother. My baby. Oh, God, my baby." Mark, who had been shoved into the room with us, was leaning against a wall, looking like he was going to be sick. "I didn't know," he kept repeating, his voice hollow. "I swear to God, I didn't know." For the first time, I felt a flicker of something other than pure hatred for him. He was a victim in this, too. We all were. His mother, Brenda, finally got a hold of herself. She stood up, her eyes landing on Lily. The venom was gone, replaced by a strange, complex expression of horror and something else. Recognition? She walked over slowly, her expensive heels silent on the thick carpet. She looked at the baby in Chloe's arms, her gaze tracing Lily's tiny features. "She has his eyes," Brenda whispered, so quietly I almost didn't hear her. "She has the doctor's eyes, just like Mark." That's when everything broke. It wasn't about the fight anymore, or the child support, or the public humiliation. It was about 4 families, because that's what we were now, shattered by one man's unimaginable betrayal. In that sterile, silent green room, the war ended. My father, David, walked over to his brother, Michael. They didn't say anything. They just stood there for a long moment before my dad pulled him into a hug. 2 old men, brothers who thought the other was long dead, weeping for a lifetime of lost time. My mom and Brenda just stared at each other. 2 women who were complete strangers an hour ago, now bound by the most intimate and horrific secret. They were sisters, twins, and they had both been violated by the same man. The show's producers, to their credit, handled it with surprising humanity once the cameras were off. They offered counseling, legal teams, and a private jet to fly us all home, far away from the media storm that was about to erupt. We accepted. On the flight, a new kind of silence fell. It wasn't tense or angry. It was heavy with the weight of our new reality. My dad and Michael sat together, quietly talking, filling in the 70-year gaps in their lives. My mom and Brenda sat across from them, sharing whispered pieces of their separate childhoods, finding eerie similarities in their mannerisms, their laugh, their shared love for gardening. Mark came and sat next to Chloe. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice raw, "for everything, for what I said, for how I treated you. I was an idiot, And I was wrong. Chloe looked at her daughter, asleep in her car seat, then back at him. We were both wrong, she said softly. About everything. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a start. A recognition that their story was no longer about a simple betrayal, but a tragedy of Shakespearean proportions. We landed back in our small town as a different group of people than the one that had left. We were no longer the Evanses versus the Petersons. We were just family. A broken, complicated, and completely messed up family. The legal battles that followed were grueling, but we faced them together. We joined a class action lawsuit with dozens of other families against the estate of the deceased fertility doctor. We won. The money helped, providing a secure future for Lily and the other children, but it could never erase the trauma. The real healing happened slowly, quietly, away from the cameras. It happened at Sunday dinners where my dad and Uncle Michael would tell stories about a childhood neither could fully remember. It happened when my mom and Aunt Brenda discovered they both used the same obscure brand of tea, a small, silly connection that made them both cry. It happened the first time Mark held Lily, not as a burden or a mistake, but as his niece, his family, a piece of his own history. He became a fixture in her life, the fun uncle who spoiled her rotten, his way of atoning. Life is not a TV show. There was no neat and tidy ending, but there was a resolution. Lily will grow up knowing her story, as strange and painful as it is. She'll grow up surrounded by a massive, chaotic, and fiercely protective family, born from secrets and lies, but held together by a strange and resilient kind of love. We went on the Steve Harvey show looking for a simple answer, yes or no. Instead, we found the truth. And the truth, it turned out, was a whole new family.